welcome back to Miss Bell's classroom. Today in class we will be talking about U.S. history, starting with the 1900s, and this is going to be our United States History of the Decades series. So we'll be talking about the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, and so on until we get to the 2000s. So here are some of the topics that we'll be covering: presidents of the decades, major events that happened, fashion, music, movies, sports, immigration, and inventions. So I hope that you enjoy and stay tuned, especially if there's any decades that you really want to learn about. This is a great place to start. So first I'm going to start by talking about the presidents. So in the 1900s, the president was William McKinley, and then Teddy Roosevelt was elected in 1904. And to finish off the decade, William Taft was elected in 1908. So does anyone know what dollar bill William McKinley is on? Yes. It's not the 100. Yes. It's not the $1. It is actually the $500 bill. And William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. And at that time, Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt, took over as president. And Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest president ever at 42 years old. William Taft was the president who created the income tax, and he was the president after Theodore Roosevelt. There's actually some fun, interesting facts about William Taft, so I'm going to go ahead and say them. At 332 pounds, Taft was the heaviest president in history. After getting stuck in the White House bathtub, he had the standard sized bathtub removed and a larger one installed. He once fell asleep during a parade where he was the main attraction. He started the tradition of throwing out the first ball of the MLB baseball season. So, any questions so far? Okay, so now let's move on to some major events that happened in the 1900s. In 1900, there was a major hurricane to hit the U.S. called the Galveston Hurricane, and it killed around 6,000 to 8,000 people. The Gold Standard Act was in place in 1900, making gold the currency in the U.S. In 1907, a financial crisis occurred in the business community with the beginning of the financial panic and depression of 1907. So, raise your hand. Has anyone ever heard of the Wright brothers? Okay, so most of us have. What are they famous for? Something with airplanes? Yeah, they created the first airplane. So I'm going to show you a picture of them. So these are the Wright brothers, and they were the first two people to invent the first airplane. And go ahead and tape that up. So the Wright brothers made the first controlled sustained flight in aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. This is them. Another major event was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was enacted by Congress in the 20th century, and it led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. And it was created to ban foreign and interstate traffic on mislabeled food and drug products. In 1908, the FBI was created. And the FBI was created largely due to President McKinley's assassination. And in 1903, the U.S. acquired the Panama Canal. Another major event was on May 15th, 1905, the city of Las Vegas, Nevada, was formed with the sale of 110 acres in the downtown area. 1905, raise your hand if you've heard of Albert Einstein. A lot of us have. So Albert Einstein in 1905 first proposed his theory of relativity, and what it did was it explained the behavior of objects in space and time, and it had a huge influence on the understanding of the universe. So Albert Einstein determined that the laws of physics are the same for all non-accelerating observers, and that the speed of light in a vacuum was independent of the motion of all observers. As a result, he found that space and time were interwoven into the single continuum known as space-time. So events that occur at the same time for one observer could occur at different times for another. Extremely complex that he did this in 1905, so that's amazing. So go ahead and take some notes. If you have any questions about that, I can repeat things. Yes, that was in 1905. So there were no major military conflicts in this decade. In 1909, the troops of the United States leave Cuba for the first time since the beginning of the Spanish-American War, which ended in 1898. So those are kind of all of the major events that happened in that decade. So now I'm going to move on to one of my favorites. We're going to talk about fashion in the 1900s. So in the 1900s, for women, the S-bend corset was fashionable during the 1900s. It thrust the hips backwards and forced the chest forward into a fashionable powder pigeon shape, emphasized with puffed, frilly blouses that were often embellished with decorations like lace collars and broad ribbon ties. Hair was parted in the middle for men and women, and hair was often looped and wore with a broad brim hat, often with flowers, lace, and ribbon. So this is kind of a little timeline of women's fashion here. So we see here that this is the 1900s. We can see that their hair is parted in the middle, but they also like to wear those broad brim hats with the lace and the ribbon and the flowers. And you kind of can see that they liked their hips backward and their chest puffed forward in this picture here. So that was kind of the fashion of the 1900s. Does anyone notice anything else about it? Yes. So it's lots of decorations like lace. They have some buttons there. But their hats are kind of that was a major statement for their fashion. Good. Tape this up there so you can still see it. And it looks much fancier than what we wear today. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about the women's clothing, we're going to talk about men's now. So men would often wear three-piece lounge suits with bowler or cloth caps, and the jackets were very narrow with small, high lapels. Most collars were starched and upstanding with the corners pointing downwards. Some men wore their collars turned down with rounded edges and modern knotted ties. Beards were mostly reserved for older men, and most young men sported neat mustaches and short hair. So here's kind of an example of that. As you can see, their hats, their three-piece suits, and they like to have that mustache with the curved right there. Here's kind of another example. The men, so they wore those hats, those three-piece suits. They had their collars were sometimes turned down. Sometimes they had modern knotted ties. You can see. Look much nicer than a lot of men dress today. And then here is kind of some of the hair that you might see them wearing. So you can see their mustaches were curved up. And then the older men mostly wore beards. That's usually the younger men wouldn't. We can see that. And they parted their hair in the middle. And then another interesting thing is the bathing suits were a lot different then too. So they are more reserved, but you can kind of see the women, it was like a piece of clothing, like a dress, and they even wore tights and shoes. It's a lot different than now. Could you imagine how difficult that would be to swim in? How heavy that would feel? So now we're going to move on to music and movies. So in the 1900s, movies became a very popular attraction in amusement arcades, music halls, traveling fairs, wax museums, and vaudeville houses in many countries. However, audience had become bored with daily life scenes and films of news events. In the 1900s, the most popular type of music was jazz, blues, folk, country, and gospel. So go ahead and take some notes. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sports. So in January 1901, the American League of Major League Baseball declares itself a major league after one season as minor league, stemming from the minor Western League in 1899. So there were 8 charter teams, including the Baltimore Orioles, the Boston Americans, Chicago White Sox, Cleveland Blues, Detroit Tigers, Milwaukee Brewers, Philadelphia Athletics, and the Washington Senators. 1901 signified its initial year of competition as Major League, competing against the Senior National League circuit. On October 1st, 1903, the first modern World Series of Major League Baseball, with the American League winner, the Boston Americans, coming out on top 5-3 in 8 games over the Pittsburgh Pirates. On May 5th, 1904, Cy Young of the Boston Americans pitches the first perfect game against the Philadelphia Athletics in the modern era of Major League Baseball. So, any questions about sports? Okay, so feel free to take some notes. I'll give you a few seconds to do that, to catch up. If you need me to repeat anything, or you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, so now we're going to talk about immigration. So from 1901 to 1910, around 8 million immigrants arrived in the U.S. In 1910, 3/4 of New York City's population was either immigrants or first-generation Americans. And unlike the earlier immigrants, the majority of the newcomers after 1900 came from non-English-speaking European countries. So the main source of the immigrants were now Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Italy, Poland, and Russia, countries that were quite different in culture and language from the United States, which meant that the so-called new immigrants had a lot of difficulty adjusting to life in the United States. At the same time, the United States had difficulty absorbing the immigrants. Most of the immigrants chose to settle in American cities where jobs were located. As a result, the cities became more and more crowded. But most of the immigrants did find jobs, although they were often worked in jobs that most native-born Americans would not take. In 1904, the Chinese were permanently excluded from the naturalization, and in 1906, English was made a requirement for naturalization. The Immigration Act of 1907 then limited the number of Japanese immigrants and created the Dillingham Commission to review U.S. immigration policy. Any questions about that so far? Okay, so go ahead and take some notes. So now we're going to talk about inventions, some of the more famous inventions in the 1900s. So raise your hand if you think you know where the first movie theater in the United States opened up at. I'll give you a clue. It's where a lot of movies are produced today. Yes, Los Angeles. Very good. So in 1902, the first movie theater in the United States opens in Los Angeles, California, and it was known as the Electric Theater. In January 1903, there was another very cool invention. It was the first two-way wireless communication between Europe and the United States, and that was accomplished by Guglielmo Marconi when he transmitted a message from President Theodore Roosevelt to the King of England from a telegraph station. And as I discussed earlier, in December 1903, the first successful airplane was created by the Wright brothers. Another invention in 1904. In November 1904, the first successful field tractor was invented by American Benjamin Holt, using a caterpillar track to spread the weight in heavy agricultural machinery. In the 1900s, the first license plates were established in the U.S., and also the New York subway was established. Another big invention was in 1908, the Ford Model T was introduced by Henry Ford. And this is an example of the car here. Okay, so it is time for the quiz. So I hope that you took some good notes. You can use your notes for the quiz. So please take out a notebook, write the numbers 1 through 10, and I will go ahead and read you your quiz questions. Make sure your name is on it so I can give you your points. Right. Give you a few more seconds to do this. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. So number 1, what was the war that happened in the 1900s? Number 2, who is on the $500 bill? What president? Number 3, what countries did many of the immigrants migrate from in the 1900s? Number 4, what was one famous invention? And you can look up here for a clue. See any up there or anything that you remember. Number 5, what 2 teams played in the first modern World Series game? So you have to say both teams to get your point for that. Number 6, who proposed the theory of relativity? Number 7, what year was the FBI established? Number 8, what city did the first movie theater open in? Think about Hollywood. Number 9, who became president after President McKinley's death? Number 10, what was the currency in the US in the 1900s? And number 11 is an extra credit. List one fact you learned about the 1900s and share it in the comments. Right. Does anyone need me to repeat any questions? Okay. So I'm going to go over the answers, so I would like you to check your work to see how you did. So number 1, what was the war that happened in the 1900s? That was a trick question. There were no wars. Number 2, who is on the $500 bill? That was President McKinley. Number 3, where did many of the immigrants migrate from in the 1900s? The main ones were Italy, Poland, and Russia. Number 4, what was one famous invention? So you could have said the New York subway, the movie theater, the plane, like the Wright brothers, Ford Model T, a field tractor, two-way wireless communication, and number 5, what teams played in the first modern World Series game? You had to have both of these, the Boston Americans and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Number 6, who proposed the theory of relativity? Albert Einstein. Number 7, what year was the FBI established? It was established in 1908. Number 8, what city did the first movie theater open in? It's in Los Angeles. Number 9, who became president after President McKinley's death? It was Theodore Roosevelt. And number 10, what was the currency in the US in the 1900s was gold. Number 11 was list one fact you learned about the 1900s and share it in the comments. So that varies, and I am excited to see something you learned. So go ahead and grade your quiz. Let me know how you did. And I hope that you learned some interesting facts or had a refresher about the 1900s decade. Have a restful sleep. Good night.